Hi, my name is Todd Leonard.
And my name is Herb Montgomery, and we're just talking.
Thanks for taking a moment to click the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon. We appreciate it.
So, if you're new to this channel, each week Todd and I take a moment to talk about the upcoming weekend's lectionary reading from the Gospels. Our goal is to talk about those readings in the context of love and inclusion and social justice. Our hope is that our talking will be just talking, as in justice, but that also something will be said during this time as we go back and forth that it would inspire you along with us to do more in our justice work than just talking. So, Todd, what are we looking at this week?
We are in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, and verses 26 through 39.
So, I freaking love this story. This is one of my favorite stories in the Gospels, whether it's Mark's version or Luke's version. I just love it because it's
Mm,
so transparent. First of all, it's a difficult story in our post enlightenment worldview.
mm,
We most of us don't subscribe to a worldview that serves that this story would serve anymore.
mm.
Right? But this is the story of the demon possessed man in Gerasenes, the region of Gerasenes, and yeah, there's a lot here to unpack. It was a. I am of the opinion that these stories, um, Matthew and Luke, they based their versions off of Mark's, and in Mark was using them metaphorically, and so we can talk about that a little bit too. But any what are your thoughts about this week's story? What are your feelings towards it? Good, bad, ugly, uncomfortable?
I thought this was always a very fascinating story. And yeah, I mean, I think the whole demon concept um, is interesting, and yeah, the more I've developed and journeyed through the reading of the scriptures, the more challenging that supernatural part of the story becomes. But um, but it's the implications of what happens to the man, what happens, and how the disciples and the villagers respond to what happens is very fascinating. And so, yeah, no, I've always found this story something to chew on.
Yeah, so I do believe that these stories, like if you and I'm gonna we'll talk about this in a minute, but if you take this story specifically as kind of like the key to unlocking the code for all the other exorcism stories in the Gospels, I think
Hmm.
there's something here that shows us that these stories were more political than they were cosmological. There wasn't about the,
Mm.
the demon inhabited world. But I will say this, even if we don't take it metaphorically, William Herzog, I read this recently and I was fascinated by it. William Herzog II, in his book Parables as Subversive Speech, Jesus as Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He's a big Ferrer fan, Paulo Ferrer, the Pedagogy of the Oppressed author, and he looks at Jesus's parables as in that same vein, in the same way that Paulo Ferrer was looking at, you know, um, education and language to educate for the oppressed to educate themselves, where empire and colonialism wasn't going to do that. Colonialism isn't going to educate you out of colonialism. They're going to
Hmm.
ingrain that oppression, right? So what does
Hmm.
pedagogy for the oppressed look like? Well, Herzog has this theory that maybe Jesus's parables could have been the same thing under Roman occupation, and
Hmm.
doing some education to help them reverse the internalization of oppression that Rome had affected them with. But he has this
Hmm.
section. The whole point of what I'm saying is he has this section there where he shows that colonialism, of which the Roman Empire's model of taking over the world wasn't much different. I know
Hmm.
we wouldn't call it colonialism. That's kind of anachronistic, but but it was the same style of taking over the world. But he shows how colonialism in South America specifically produced the same side effects for people with their mental health
Hmm.
that would look like um, your mental health breaking down in such a way that if you
Hmm.
were living back in the first century, you might have called that demon
Hmm.
possession.
Interesting.
But that, so even if you take it that way, there is some scientific basis for whatever this story is referring to as,
Hmm.
the self-harm of this guy and the
Hmm.
isolation of this guy, and that there are people, there were members of the indigenous communities who suffered under the hands of colonial occupation, who exhibited these same types of symptoms that we would now call, this mental illness triggering from
Hmm.
being
Hmm.
subjugated,
Hmm.
losing their culture, losing their, that they,
Yeah.
so that's a little fascinating.
You could,
You can,
and I mean, I'm studying counseling right now, and and that just struck a thought for me of, you could look at the story of this person and say, this guy may have been through some real serious stuff in his life and maybe been mistreated horribly by the oppressing forces, and that he could be experiencing a PTSD, a significant PTSD, which causes, we know, so what some of our veterans go through and what they experience, and how their behavior gets significantly modified because their minds have been so transformed by the violence they've experienced. And
mhm.
so that certainly would, if we want to say that this is somewhat a story that actually took place, using language and metaphor and knowledge of the time, that this could very well, maybe we're looking at somebody with a serious PTSD issue.
Like we would use different context and language, and
Hmm.
we would look at this through a different lens today because of our worldview today. But it's the same dynamic, it's the same reality, and they're just
Hmm.
using the language and worldview that they have available to them at
Right.
that time to
Right.
explain the same scenario.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even if, though, all of that is true, I love the fact that the demon's name is Legion here.
Hmm.
I love that when he's asked, "What is your name?" he says, "We are Legion. Our name is Legion, for we are many." And the Legion, we know that was the term for the largest occupying force of the Roman army.
Hmm.
When Rome took over a problematic region, they would establish a legion in that area to keep the peace.
Hmm.
And I still believe that even though we could explain it the way we just did for the last 5 minutes,
Hmm.
I still believe it makes a powerful metaphor for how Rome possessed or
Hmm.
occupied a territory in that region. And the fact that, I cannot, there is no way, you cannot convince me that someone who would be hearing this story in Luke's original audience,
Hmm.
when that demon proclaims their name as Legion, they would not have immediately thought of
Yeah.
Roman occupying forces keeping the people under
Everybody knew what
thumb.
that was. Everybody knew what that was. So it was obvious, very obvious.
Yeah, they would have thought Roman occupying forces. That's
Yep.
who is possessing our land. That's who this demon is possessing this
Mm.
individual.
Mm.
It's a
Mm.
metaphor.
Yep.
And so, and two, when Jesus, and we can talk about what this meant culturally for a second too, but when Jesus sends when he casts the demons out and sends them into the nearby pigs, it's interesting to note that they're not saying, and we're talking, there's so much to unpack here. My thoughts are running together. But what the demons ask is, do not force us to leave this, not man, do not force us to leave this region,
Mm,
this area, which is
mm,
exactly how the Roman legions were assigned. They were assigned to
mm,
that legion. So what does Jesus do? He sends them into the pigs, and the pigs
mm,
run off the cliff, and they're drowned in the sea of the sea there. And the language that's used there too is the same language that's used in the Exodus folklore, the Exodus narratives of how Pharaoh's armies were
mm,
drowned in the sea, the Red Sea.
mm,
And so, which, or whatever. But there's this parallel language of liberation from
mm.
oppression, and it's applied now with Rome, but it's the same language that was used in how in the Exodus folklore for the liberating narratives back then.
Yeah, that's and this it's refreshing to hear this concept being brought up, because again, when you look again, what I like about this is this is not this is not you or other scholars who have seen this. This is not you coming up with some gimmick twist of story that is unique to the scriptures. What you're even though it is, like you said, it could be a model passage for reading other passages. The idea of prophets and teachers using previous stories of scripture and using previous occupying narratives of scripture and using that metaphor to discuss the current situation. That's standard prophetic interpretation work.
Yes, yes,
And
that's how it works.
so the writer of Luke is doing this, the person of Jesus is doing this. It's just standard prophetic work.
Yeah, yeah, and what I love about it too, as we talk about it being a lens for other stories, if we allow this to be that, like I said, like when we used to be kids, we would get these. The toys used to come in the cereal boxes, and you'd have the messages on the back of the cereal boxes. I remember once there's a message but inside the cereal box, if you ate all the cereal, there was a decoder that if you got it out, you
Mm-hmm.
could decode the message on the back of the cereal box. And, we were little, we thought it was really cool. But but
Mm-hmm.
but but this is kind of like the decoder in the cereal box. With that, if you use this to read all the other exorcism stories, you
Mm-hmm.
start to see a pattern in all of the demonology stories in the gospel saying, no, this really is about liberating the oppressed through talking about liberation from the Roman Empire's occupation of their land.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And it's just fascinating.
yeah. It's very.
And we want to kind of eject the story. We kind of want to resist the story or kick it or ignore it or marginalize it or say, it doesn't fit in with my scientific post-enlightenment worldview in my
Yeah.
non-super, what I'm saying? So we ignore these stories. But if we don't go down that road, if we actually listen to what this story is saying, it's a story. If we'll give it permission to speak in its own language of its own time and its
Mm-hmm.
own worldview, it's actually speaking deep political liberation themes even today.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Well, that's exactly right. And that's that's what makes these stories still relevant 2,000 years later, is because they have done the work. They speak deeply to anybody who is in an oppressed position, and they say to anybody, this is how God works for those who are oppressed. This is how God works against the oppressor. This is always God's purpose in these type of situations, whether it's the Hebrews in Egypt, whether it's the Jews in Babylon, whether it's uh, whether it's those under Roman occupation during the Roman Empire,
Yeah, absolutely.
and whether they're under
Or
oppression here today.
right. Or exactly. Whether you're a migrant or
Mm,
South American community under European oppression
mm,
today. And that's a great segue I mentioned this book last week, Todd, but I want to mention it again for our listeners, our watchers, our audience, whatever the right word is. Robert Romero, in his book, it was in 2020, so it's 5 years old already, but it's a book called Brown Church: 5 Centuries of Latino Social Justice, Theology, and Identity. And he does an incredible job at showing the striking parallels between the way Galileans were viewed within the Judea Galilean Jewish community, how the Galilean Jews were viewed, and the striking parallels between that and um, how our Mexican American or South American American or migrant community is viewed in the
Mm,
U.S. today.
mm,
Galileans were um, considered not as Jewish as Judean Jews. They were more
mhm,
marginal because they were closer to Gentile regions, and this story bears this out. It doesn't say they were eating the pigs, but pigs being unclean for Jewish people, these Jewish people were at least profiting off the industry. You know what I mean? Maybe they were exporting them to other Gentiles or to the Roman
mhm.
Empire. They were profiting, off of it. So, and that would have been something that a strict, Puritan or purist, a more uh, purity, style of Jew would not have, they would have been too
Privileged.
unclean.
Hmm.
Yes, yes, yes. The elite would have never done this. But the Galilean Jews, they were the blue collar Jews. They were the agricultural workers. They were the ones that harvested most of the food for
Hmm.
Judea, and then was also shipped off to Rome. So they were a very rural agricultural people. They
Hmm.
spoke the dialect, the Aramaic, with a certain accent. Even they were Galilean, kind of like the same way you think of like Southerners, how they speak English with a certain accent.
Hmm.
But he goes even further and talks about how it's the same way you can tell if someone's a Spanish speaking American, that they have that accent and how they speak
Hmm.
English. And he just brings out parallel after parallel after parallel of how Galilean Jews were viewed by the elite Jews in Judea of that time, and how that's very similar to where South American Americans who have a South American background or heritage or culture,
Hmm.
how they're viewed today, and how from the Mexican War. When Mexico, the land, as we mentioned last week, changed under the feet of these people who were living in Mexico, and now that land is now the U.S. We talk about New Mexico and parts of
Hmm.
Texas and Arizona and those different
California.
areas, how that all just switched underneath them. They were not given full citizenship immediately. They were not viewed the
Right.
same way European Americans were viewed. And so, yeah, just that less than the same way Galileans were viewed as less than, not real, not fully fully
Hmm.
Jewish as some
Hmm.
of the others. Right. So there's all these parallels. And then I'm thinking about this week that when Jesus shows up and he comes as a Galilean, he shows up working in Galilee. And here we have a story happening in Galilee this week about how Roman occupation is causing this whatever internalization inside of this man, and I cannot help but draw parallels there between the five-alarm fire that's happening in our migrant communities right
Hmm.
now in the US.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
think there's some parallels there too.
Yeah. Well, and I love that, in to to still hold on to a concept that I think is deeply deeply profound, even if some of the factual realities of it may not be so much rooted in fact as it is in metaphor. But the really, I love the incarnational concept of this, of Jesus being there as a Galilean, Jesus
Mm-hmm.
be coming from that position, not coming from the privileged position as a Judean or a Roman, and coming in to rescue riding in on his horse to rescue, but he comes from within. He is one of them, and he rises
Mm,
up with his people and is in solidarity with them as he seeks to bring liberation. I think that is beautiful. It's profound, and it would when people always ask, well, how would Jesus show up today? Well,
right,
that
right.
take your cue from this and see where that would fit. What populations would Jesus show up as today?
Yeah, yeah. It seems that in this context, he would have showed up as an indigenous person trying to survive under colonial
Mm-hmm.
occupation of land that used to belong to their forefathers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's pretty striking.
Yeah. Well, and if you look at the hierarchy of class in this country, and not just in this country, but in the Western Hemisphere, those of European descent, whatever European nationality, if you have European blood in you, you are ranked higher in the
Yeah,
hierarchy
absolutely.
than if you are more purely indigenous in your heritage. There's still that is the case.
And that's the parallel that Romero was trying to draw between the Jews that were in Judea and Jerusalem and the temple and that being the center. And then you had these more marginal on the other side of Samaria,
Mm-hmm.
you had these marginalized Jews over there in Galilee, the Galilean Jews. They weren't as they were looked at in the same way as we look as Americans that have European heritage versus
Mm-hmm.
Americans that have other heritage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This we're all American, but some of us are less American
Yeah,
than others.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Some of us are part of the what's the rhetoric Miller is using right now? It's not even worth repeating, so never mind. But
Yeah. Yeah.
not under in we're not being invaded. Let me just say that. We're not being
Right.
invaded.
Right. There's a interesting line from a movie that is called The Good Shepherd. It's a CIA movie, but there's this dialogue between a waspy CIA agent with an Italian mobster, and they're talking about, or the Italian person brings up his appreciation of this American country, and that both he and the CIA agent are Americans, and the CIA agent said, "Let me make this clear: America is my country,
Mm,
and we're just letting the rest of you all be here."
mm,
And so the difference between the New England born and bred uh, American and the
sure.
first generation immigrant uh, American, there's worlds apart, and so Jesus comes in and identifies with those who are viewed as just renters on the
Right.
land,
Right. Right.
sharecroppers.
Yeah. Yeah. And two, another parallel, you bring up sharecroppers. Another parallel is that a lot of these lands that used to belong to Mexicans that they owned, they ended up when the territory changed from being Mexican to, or from Mexico to the United States, Gulf of America type garbage. When that happened back in the wake of the Mexican U.S. Mexican War, a lot of the lands that they owned, they eventually ended up being day laborers on that
Mm,
land that
mm,
used to belong to them.
mm,
And just tragic the way that injustice ripped apart their lives and their everything they had established. And in the same way in Galilee, so many of those farmers who used to own those lands in Jesus's day, they were now indentured
yeah,
slaves or day
yeah,
laborers on the farms they used to own.
yeah.
I mean, there's so many parallels So
Yeah.
if you're teaching from the lectionary this week, I don't always do this, but if you're teaching from the lectionary this week, I want to throw out these three books. Robert Romero's Brown Church, already mentioned that one. William Herzog, already mentioned this one, Parables as Subversive Speech, Jesus as Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And then the last one is Ched Meyer's book, Finding the Strong Man, a political reading of Mark's story. And that's because this story in Luke finds its origin in the Gospel of Mark. And it's worth taking a look at. I'll just read this. Mark appears to acknowledge, this is from Ched Meyer's book. Mark appears to acknowledge the reality that no one had the strength to subdue the demon of Roman military occupation, including the Jewish rebels. Yet he makes his revolutionary stance clear by symbolically reenacting the Exodus story through a herd of pigs. With a divine command, the imperial forces are drowned in the sea. It gets even better than that. So just if you're teaching from the lectionary this week and you're just wanting some stuff to make it applicable to what's going on in the U.S. right now, those are three
Mhm.
books that are worth just checking out in
Mhm.
relation to this story and the present migrant
Yeah.
crisis that we're in.
And this has such, I mean, and again, you step back now and look at the story within this context of what you've put together for us, and you say, this story is so much bigger than somebody being demon possessed. Demon possession, if it exists, if there's anything like it that exists, is such a rare, uh, unique, and not relevant to a lot of us. But you pull this into and seeing what this actually represents. It places all of us on notice to say, are we who are we with?
Yeah,
Are
which
we
side of this issue right now are we on?
are we on the side of the guy who's just been that Jesus sets free? Are we on the side of liberating people, or are we going to be running with the
On the
pigs?
side of the oppressors. Yeah, right, right, right. And two, this explains so well for me why the people freaked out and said, "No, no, Jesus, you got to get out of here. We know you just
Yeah.
delivered this." Like if he was just possessed, if he was just
Again, why
exercising
would
a
that
demon from,
bother people?
why would they freak out so bad and say, "You
No.
got to get out of here"?
Yeah.
But if this was the political threat against Roman occupying forces, that they knew that the response to this was going
Hmm.
to, I mean, Rome's response to any type of liberation activity was heavy-handed, it was fast, it was cruel, it was brutal, and
Yeah.
they were like, Jesus, they got afraid and they said, Jesus, you got to go. You can't be here. You can't stay here.
And again, this makes it so much more profound because how many times in the gospel accounts do you have Jesus having to dash out quickly because he's got somebody so ticked off
Yeah.
that they're about to kill him? Again, this doesn't happen with somebody who is
Passing out
just
tickets to heaven. That
that's
doesn't
right,
produce the same effect.
who's just doing spiritual work.
That's right.
It's this is somebody who's rubbing a lot of politically powerful people the wrong way on a regular basis, not
It
just
would
once
do
or twice.
it would do well to remember that the end of Jesus's ministry lands him on a Roman cross, which is how they executed political
Yeah,
troublemakers.
yeah,
So yeah, there's a lot here to unpack.
yeah. Hmm.
So there were some passages from the Hebrew scriptures that I focused on this week too, in my own dealing with this passage, my own how I worked with it. Um, Exodus, don't mistreat or oppress the foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. When a foreigner resides among you, don't mistreat them. You must treat them as your native born. Love
Hmm.
them as yourself, for you
Hmm.
were foreigners in Egypt. And,
Hmm.
and uh, yeah, this is what the sovereign Lord says: do what is just and right, rescue from the hand of the oppressor, the one who has been robbed do no wrong or violence to the foreigner. And Ezekiel 22, the people of the land practiced extortion, they commit robbery, they oppress the poor, the needy, and they mistreat the foreigner, denying them justice. I thought about that this week with how due process is
Mm-hmm.
being denied.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the indiscriminate roundup that uh, Immigration and Customs Services are doing right now, and the denial of due process that has been practiced over the last
Mm-hmm.
few months, just to mistreat the foreigner, deny them justice. There's a lot. It just still surprises me. There is so much in the scriptures about how
Yeah.
we treat migrants in our land, and it doesn't mention anything about legal status or not. And I just want to go on record: legal status says nothing about a person's character. It says
Right.
nothing about what kind of a human they are.
Right.
Um, and there's so much in the scriptures about not mistreating and not denying justice to those in that community. And it is appalling to me that we have so many swaths of sectors of Christianity that their xenophobic rhetoric right now is just
Mm-hmm.
flaming. It's just fanning the flames
Mm-hmm.
of the injustice that's taking place right now. So it's appalling to me that any Christian would be in favor of the way um, migrants are being treated right now. And I know that our immigration complex, our crisis is complex. I get that, and our
Mm-hmm.
immigration policies, they need overhauled.
Of course.
Absolutely, we
Of
need
course.
reform. But in that process, we don't need to be shattering people's lives with the
No.
brutality that we are right now.
Right. And and the reason why, just to go back to what you said about why so many people of faith can can say they are followers of Jesus, are followers of the Bible, of and at the same time be comfortable with this treatment of the immigrant population, is because they have continued to see the stories of Jesus and the stories of God as having nothing to do with the present world and having everything to do with them being saved for the afterlife. And so anything that doesn't speak to going to the afterlife, or that they can't interpret as speaking to my personal eternal salvation, my personal relationship with God, they ignore or reinterpret. And this is and so this is why seeing the scriptures, all the scriptures, the Hebrew prophets, the early stories, historical stories, to the gospel stories, these are intricately integrated into the
Mm.
political lives of the people of the time. This is not speaking about anything other than that. When you're reading, and people know this from reading in the Hebrew prophets, there's at least some awareness that they know the Hebrew prophets were speaking about the exile and liberation of their time. But somehow we have totally twisted around the teachings and actions of Jesus to have nothing to do with the
Mhm.
political ramifications of his time, and therefore don't feel there's any application of his time and his real and his ministry to our time
Mhm.
and our ministry.
It would do us well. I think it would be healthy. We would be healthier Christians. And for any of you who this might sound like the initial response to be, just sit with it for a minute. We would be healthier Christians if we forgot about the existence of an afterlife.
Mm,
And instead, we read these stories seeking to answer the question, how should I live my life today?
mm,
What is the intrinsically life giving way to live our lives now? And let the afterlife questions take care of themselves.
Hmm. The afterlife questions were there. They exist. People wondered about it. Absolutely, it's there. People. So it doesn't mean that it does away with those questions. But you're exactly right. The prophetic tradition was about now, always
Mm-hmm.
about now, and Jesus is completely in line with what he's doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a lot. That's a lot to chew on this week, Todd.
It's good stuff, man. I like it.
That's all I got.
All right.
I'm out.
Okay. We'll see you. Tell us about Renewed Heart Ministries quickly
All
before
right.
you leave us.
No, no, I just meant I'm out of stuff. I'm out of stuff. I'm
Oh,
all
oh,
empty.
oh, oh. I thought you were
I'm
going to
not
turn
out
off
of
your.
here. I'm not leaving. I mean, I could
Yeah.
be. I mean, if you want me to, I will. But no, I'm just out of stuff. That's all I have. That's all I brought with me. My bag's
Okay.
empty.
All right.
No, Renewed Heart Ministries. If any of you are unfamiliar with Renewed Heart Ministries, we are a not for profit organization passionate about helping people discover the intersection of their faith and whatever area of social justice they might be passionate about. All of our resources are free. You can check us out at renewedheartministries.com. And the reason that they're free is we are directly dependent on our supporters to be able to provide those resources for free. We don't do subscription services. We don't do, and I'm not saying anything that's bad. I'm just saying we don't do it. Freely we've received, freely we try to give. And so I do want to say a special thank you, a shout out there to all of our supporters who support the work of Renewed Heart Ministries each month to enable us to do that. If you would like to join, if any of you out there would like to join them in supporting Renewed Heart Ministries work, you can do that by going to renewedheartministries.com and clicking donate. But whether you do that or not, go to renewedheartministries.com and just take advantage of the resources that are there for free. Todd, you got anything?
I don't. TJLCC.com if you're interested in coaching.
All right.
So thank you guys for joining us. We are always glad to have you around. Herb was trying to decide how to describe you as an audience or as our viewers or whatever. I
Listeners,
thought of
viewers,
I thought of a word, cyber buddy. I don't
Cyber
know.
Buddy.
That
We have
sounds kind
Cyber
of.
Buddies.
I don't know. It
I
sounds
like it.
kind of. You like it?
I do
Okay.
like it. Cyber
Okay.
Buddies.
Well, all right. We'll go with that. We'll keep thinking, see if we come up with another term. But for tonight, thanks for joining us, cyber
I
buddies.
I used to listen to a podcast that called their people podritioners.
Ooh, that's more sophisticated than what I came up with. That's pretty
No, I
good.
like Cyber Buddies better.
Hmm.
I like Cyber Buddies. Cyber Pals.
Cyber pals. That's a
Cyber
little.
Pals.
It might be. I might like that better. We'll think about it. We'd have like a whole club.
Vote in the
Co-
comments. Please tell us in the comments.
Please, please.
All right, everyone. Thanks for hanging out with us this week. We'll see you next week.